The last lecture focused on the emergence of political violence in the Roman Republic, and in particular, the emergence of political violence connected to the reforms of Tiberius Gracchus and the use of threats and intimidation that he deployed to try to get his reforms implemented. When contemporaries and when subsequent Romans thought about the implications of what Tiberius Gracchus had done, many of them gradually came to the realization that the culture of violence that had begun with subtle threats and intimidation had progressed to the point where violence had become a political tool. And as this political tool was deployed more regularly, people got better at using it. The course of the lecture today is going to talk about that evolving political technology of violence in a republican environment and what it actually meant for Rome. And it's important to start with the understanding that the Roman Republic before Tiberius Gracchus was a remarkably peaceful political system internally. Political violence was not something that afflicted Rome. In fact, there had been more than 300 years between the last outbreak of political violence that resulted in the death of a Roman and the murder of Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BC. But a thinker no less important than Cicero would look at this moment when Tiberius Gracchus was murdered, and he would notice that this was the moment when Rome changed fundamentally. Cicero would write that this habit of lawlessness initiated by Tiberius Gracchus, if it begins to spread, it changes our rule from one of justice to one of force. And though our own generation has been vigilant enough to be safe, I'm anxious for our descendants and for the immortality of our republic, which is capable of lasting forever if the customs and the laws of our ancestors are maintained. Now, Cicero is here putting his own concerns in the voice of characters who are supposedly participating in a political debate in 129 BC, when they are first coming to terms with the implications of the murder of Tiberius Gracchus. And what Cicero is saying here is that the moment has come for Rome to make a decision. And for Romans to decide whether their society can be brought back to a peaceful circumstance where Roman political developments are unfolding through debate, through compromise, and through negotiation, or whether violence, such as began with the threats of Tiberius Gracchus and was exacerbated by the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, becomes the rule of how Roman politics develops. And Cicero would write, "The Republic, when it came to us, was like a beautiful painting whose colors were beginning to fade. Our own time not only has neglected to freshen the Republic up by renewing the original colors, but it's not even taken the trouble to preserve its configuration." And Cicero would say, "This is because there is nothing more destructive to civilizations, and nothing is so contrary to law and justice than governing through violence in a republic." This is a very profound statement, but it's one that also very much reflects Roman realities. Rome didn't function in a way that had political institutions that governed the use of violence. Most states cannot function legally, lawfully, and with the protection of their citizens' rights when violence is part of political dissension. But Rome in particular, because it did not know political violence, did not have structures to control it. And in the generation and a half, 2 generations after the death of Tiberius Gracchus, we will see Rome becomes consumed by violence, because once violence is unleashed, the institutional structures to prevent Rome from succumbing to it and prevent Rome's representative democracy from becoming a kind of tyranny governed by violence, murder, and destruction, those safeguards did not exist. And once violence was introduced, Rome had a very difficult time pulling back. Part of the reason for this is because the Republic in the period before Tiberius Gracchus had completely failed to deal with the great structural inequalities in the Roman economy and in Roman life. And in a society where there is great inequality, and in Rome, of course, if we recall, the great inequality was caused by a financial revolution that greatly benefited the few people who had the capital to take advantage of financial markets, and saw them grow incredibly wealthy at a time when regular Romans' prospects were stagnating. In a society like that, where there's great inequality, there's always the potential that someone who is seen as being willing to address the problem will become quite powerful. And what the Gracchi, and in particular Tiberius Gracchus, represented was a figure willing to, in essence, punch back at the wealthy. In a sense, take someone who was rich and punch them in the nose. If we think back a few months, there was a TikTok, I don't know if you would call it movement, but a TikTok response to when Jeff Bezos went into space, where TikTokers said, in essence, we need to have a petition signed that says Jeff Bezos should not be allowed back into Earth. He should just be stuck in orbit forever. And something like 6 million people signed on to this. This is not a productive response to wealth inequality, but it made people feel good. It was a way to make clear to Jeff Bezos, people do not like you. They do not like a society in which people like you control such a massive portion of the total wealth in the world and in the economy. Tiberius Gracchus was, in a sense, doing a much more dangerous 2nd century BC version of the TikTok petition to keep Jeff Bezos in space. What Tiberius Gracchus was actually doing was pushing back against the powerful. And the threats were actually part of the plan. They made his reforms, which were modest and were not going to solve wealth inequality in Rome, look much more palatable and make people much more excited about them, because those reforms were things that were making the wealthy people angry. And that was the point. The people who were poor, or the people who were middle class but struggling to get a better life than their parents had enjoyed, these were the people who were most frustrated by the situation in Rome. And these were the people who responded most enthusiastically when Tiberius Gracchus pushed back against those structures that seemed to benefit few Romans at the expense of many. But there is a response after Tiberius Gracchus, and especially after Gaius Gracchus, are killed. We saw with the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, a few hundred supporters are killed. But with the murder of Gaius Gracchus, thousands are killed. And this has a chilling effect on Roman life. Because the supporters of Gaius Gracchus who are killed are some of the leading lights of his movement. These are the populists. These are the people who are looking to push back against social structures and economic structures and political structures that had advantaged the wealthy and disadvantaged everyone else. And so once the death of Gaius Gracchus is accompanied by the murder of so many prominent supporters, this movement is, in a sense, decapitated. There is no leadership to push this forward. And for the better part of a decade, populism and populist leaders fade from view. And the response to this, and the result of this, is described by the historian Appian. Appian says not long after the death of Gaius Gracchus, a law was enacted to permit holders to sell the land about which they had quarreled. And so this is basically the land that has been redistributed by the Gracchian Land Commission to poor landholders. And what happens after the death of Gaius Gracchus is a law is passed that said that these poor people who were given distributions of public land now have the right to sell it. And what Appian says is at once the rich began to buy the allotments of the poor or found pretexts for seizing them by force. And so the condition of the poor became even worse than it was before. And so what happens is this land that was distributed to poor people gets bought up by rich people. And this is even worse than the situation before, because previously rich people only leased that land from the Roman government. Now that land was taken out of public possession, given to private individuals, and now rich people have bought that land outright. And so the condition actually becomes worse than it was before, because now reform is much more difficult. And what follows is a pretty meek attempt to address this problem. So in 118, Spurius Thorius, a tribune of the plebs, brought in a law providing that the distribution of public land should be discontinued, and that the land shall belong to those in possession who should pay rent for it to the state, and the money so received should be distributed. And the distribution of this money was a kind of solace to the poor, but it didn't help increase the population, and after a while the rent itself was abolished. And so in 118, when it's recognized that the Land Commission's work is failing, a new solution is put in place. It says, in essence, the money that's paid for this public land will be redirected to provide a kind of welfare payment to the poor. But this is a short-term kind of sop to the poor. And in response, it lasts for a very short time, and then it's abolished. And Appian says, the result was this: the poor lost everything. And hence, this resulted in a further decline of both citizens and soldiers in revenue from the land, the distribution of this revenue, and in the allotments themselves. And this pattern would hold for the next 10 years. And this is a problem that has very profound implications for Rome. What we see is wealthy aristocrats begin buying the land up that had been private land, or it had been public land. They begin buying it up, they privatize it, and poor people are getting increasingly forced off of this land. And while this is happening, the highest offices in the Roman state become increasingly dominated by a very few wealthy and aristocratic Roman families. And as you would expect, this creates a culture, a very profound and dangerous culture of corruption. And there are two real problems with this. One of them concerns the decline in the number of citizens working the land. Now, the Roman army worked under a principle that any soldier serving in it needed to meet a basic property requirement. And this property requirement had been in place for a very long time. This is not a law, it's a custom. But the custom was very profound and very, very well supported by Romans, because this is an idea, the idea of the citizen soldier who has land that needs to be protected. It was a basic guarantee that the people fighting for Rome had a genuine stake in the success of the Roman army and the success of the campaign on which they were fighting, because they have land that could be damaged or destroyed. They have family members who could be captured or killed. They have a very real incentive to prevent an enemy from getting into Roman territory and taking Roman land, because they are holders of some of that land. And what this basically was designed to do was to create an army that was loyal to Rome, and overall an incorruptible army that was unable to be bought and unable to be bribed, because citizen soldiers would not make a deal with an outside power like a mercenary army, for example, would. And if we think of the situation of the Carthaginian mercenaries in Sardinia, we see the real danger of a mercenary army just simply switching sides. Roman citizens would not do that if they have land that would be exposed if the army were to switch sides. But the problem with the growing consolidation of wealth around rich landholders was that fewer and fewer people met this property requirement. And as those rich landowners and a very few of the most elite families in Rome came to dominate the consulship and the supreme offices in the state, the concern about this was subsumed by the quest for this aristocratic group to benefit from the domination that they enjoyed of Roman political life, and ultimately to protect the people in their families who did things that were wrong. And in the short term, this didn't matter very much to members of those families. They were enjoying the fruit of their domination, but ultimately the culture of corruption and the increasing deterioration of the number of Roman citizens eligible to serve in the army created a crisis. And by the end of the 110s BC, after a decade of the consulship being controlled by a few families, what we see is a few incidents emerge that really irritate people to the point where this structure becomes unsustainable. One of these involved the trial in which 3 of the Vestal virgins are brought up on charges for violating their vows for chastity by having intercourse with men. Now, these are 3 different, obviously 3 different virgins and 3 different men, but 2 of the men were senators who belonged to leading families. And in the initial investigation, those senators escaped punishment. But the 3rd person was a Roman knight. And he's a member of the class of Roman equites or Roman knights. This is the second tier of the Roman aristocracy. But he and the Vestal that he slept with were both executed, and they were executed simply because they were not elite enough. They were not powerful enough, and the prosecution and the investigation was completely corrupt. And so they were killed just simply because somebody had to be killed for this scandal, and none of the members of the aristocracy really wanted other aristocrats to be killed. But the problem with this, the most significant problem with this, is that the chief priest of the Roman religion, the Pontifex Maximus, had basically orchestrated the outcome of these trials. And this man belonged to a family called the Caecilii Metelli. The Caecilii Metelli were a family that held consulships for more than half of the years between this scandal and the death of Tiberius Gracchus. They were the most elite of these aristocratic families dominating Roman political life. This helped shift the tide. This outrage at the very clear and blatant corruption of the Roman senatorial elite helped shift the tide against the cabal of elites in 109 BC. But it wasn't the only thing. Also, while these scandals were unfolding, Rome also found itself embroiled in a military conflict with a king named Jagertha of Numidia. And Jagertha of Numidia is a very, very interesting figure. Jagertha was an illegitimate descendant of one of the kings of Numidia, and ultimately, when the king of Numidia died prior to Jagertha, the Numidian throne was supposed to be shared by two of that king's sons and Jagertha himself. But what Jagertha proceeded to do was to kill off each of the two people he was supposed to share power with in a very, very messy way. And as Jagertha was picking off his rivals, each of them appealed to Rome to try to mediate the situation. And Rome, basically, the Roman Senate and leading Roman senators were bought off by Jagertha so that they didn't take any kind of aggressive role in limiting what Jagertha was doing. Then, in 112, as Jagertha was consolidating control over the kingdom of Numidia, he captured the city of Cirta. So if you look at this map, you can see the Numidian capital of Cirta. It is like right to the right of the 6 degrees symbol. When Cirta was captured, a large number of Roman merchants in the city were killed. And this changed things because popular politicians began to demand a declaration of war, but the Senate held back until in 111 BC, a tribune of the plebs had evidence that proved that some of the senators who were holding back on declaring war against Jagertha had taken bribes from Jagertha. And at this point, the Senate was shamed into declaring war, but the Senate didn't actually want to fight this war. So the Senate declared war, but then very quickly made peace with Jagertha, and people, again, saw through the corruption. And it was so outrageous that in 110, Rome renewed the war. But a Roman army fighting this war was then defeated, and another humiliating peace was offered. At this point, the Roman Senate actually was compelled to fight this war for real. And they brought forward a consul named Caecilius Metellus of this family, the Caecilii Metelli, that had dominated the consulship for much of the previous decade. He was chosen to conduct the campaign in 109, and actually Metellus did a reasonably good job in conducting this campaign. But the campaign didn't proceed as quickly as people would want, and the culture of corruption that surrounded Metellus's family and the elites like him who had dominated the Roman state made his lack of quick progress something that looked suspicious. And at this moment, a man on Metellus's staff decided to try to take advantage of this situation and shake up the political dynamics in Rome. And this is a man named Gaius Marius. Now, Marius was a figure that was, in Roman parlance, called a novus homo, which means a new man. And Marius came from a family that was aristocratic, but it was Italian aristocratic family. It was not a hardcore Roman patrician family by any means at all. And in fact, no member of his family had ever even been in the Roman Senate. And so Marius was from an influential family, but a sort of third-tier influential family. And his political career had initially been built through a patronage relationship with the family of Caecilius Metellus. And so one member of the family had helped Marius get elected tribune in 119 BC, and this was supposed to be kind of the limit of Marius's ambitions. His family was too modest for him to aspire to much higher office, but as tribune, what Marius recognized is this position gave him the power to make a name for himself, especially when the post-Gracchian populist regime and the post-Gracchian populist politicians had basically been silenced by the murder of Gaius Gracchus. And so what Marius decided to do was to put forward a bill that would make it difficult for patrons to tamper with the ballot of their clients who are on a jury. It's a pretty modest proposal, but in the climate of the post-Gaius Gracchus world, even this modest proposal was something that Roman aristocrats opposed, just simply because it was something that undercut some of their prerogatives. And so the Senate then declared its opposition to Marius's law, and Marius was then called before the Senate to defend his conduct. And what we're told is, far from behaving like a young man who had only just begun his political career, Marius threatened to drag the consul off the prison unless he had his motion sanctioning the bill canceled. Cotta then turned to Metellus, and remember, Metellus is the patron of Marius, and he asked Metellus for his opinion, and Metellus stood up and declared that he too was in favor of the motion. Now this should, in normal Roman political context, be the end of it, right? If your political patron says, I am not in favor of what you're doing, you should stand down. And it was expected that when Metellus stood up and said that he was not in favor of what Marius was doing, Marius would stand down. But Marius responded instead by calling for the officer outside to arrest Metellus, his political patron. Now, the effect of this was great. The law went through, but even more important was Marius became a hero to those who favored populist causes but lacked leaders who would pursue them. But the other side of this is senatorial figures, and most importantly, the Metelli, are very upset with how Marius had behaved because this is a black eye to them. And for the better part of a decade, Marius suffered some serious political consequences for this. Marius did not do very well in subsequent elections, despite the fact that people were enthusiastic about the fact that he had finally stood up against aristocratic obstruction and argued for the rights of regular Romans. But again, that matters only to a certain degree. And in subsequent elections, senatorial politicians managed to sabotage Marius. In one election, he came in last, like absolutely last. And then in another, he was defeated. But eventually, he found his way, kind of tail between his legs, back onto the staff of Caecilius Metellus, the consul for 109, when Metellus was fighting Jagertha in North Africa. Now, if we remember, the war that Metellus had been fighting was a kind of slow-moving campaign because Metellus took over an army that had recently been defeated by Jagertha. Metellus had to retrain the army and rebuild its confidence. And so the war was moving slowly. And while this was happening, Marius was sending dispatches back to Rome that criticized Metellus' conduct of the war. The goal that Marius had was to use these dispatches to help his own candidacy for the consulship. And what Marius particularly hoped to do was to turn Roman anger against the corruption of the aristocratic elite and use that as an accelerant to make Marius capable of overcoming the social stigma attached to a figure like himself, a figure who did not come from a family that was senatorial, did not come from a family that had ever produced a consul, and in a way, the corruption and the failings of the aristocratic elite in the 110s made Rome ready to listen to this kind of appeal. And so Marius was able to capitalize on this anger against the narrow elite that had dominated Roman life in the 110s and win election to the consulship in a landslide. Once he was in office, Marius then got a tribune of the plebs to pass a law transferring Metellus's army in Numidia to Marius's command. Once this happened, Marius then asked for senatorial permission to raise additional forces. And the Senate did something quite interesting. Marius, of course, was expecting some sort of a major fight to try to convince the Senate that this needed to be done. Instead, what the Senate assumed was Marius is not going to be able to find the soldiers. We've been fighting Jagertha for a number of years. The war has not been going particularly well. People are not going to be super excited to do this. And so if Marius wants more soldiers, that's great. Let him go try find more soldiers. And if he finds them, more power to him, but there aren't soldiers there. And that will just quickly show that Rome was wrong to trust Marius. And that, very quickly, this fever of populism will abate and we can go back to the regular old semi-corrupt way of aristocratic domination of Roman life. But Marius surprised the Senate. What Marius did was he countered the senatorial expectation that Marius is not going to find enough troops who are willing to serve and meet the property qualification by saying, in essence, I am not going to observe the property qualification at all. So once Marius was elected and began to raise troops, contrary to law and custom, Marius enrolled in his army poor men with no property qualifications, a class of people who used not to be accepted by commanders in the past, and the commanders in the past gave arms like other honors only to those in the right income group, with the idea being that the possession of property guaranteed a man's loyalty to the state. What Marius was saying is, I actually believe that the opportunities that I will provide to these soldiers who otherwise would not qualify for service is going to make them even more energetic fighters than these property qualified soldiers who serve because it's a representation of their loyalty to Rome. In essence, Marius had changed the deal that governed Roman military service. There was an understanding that these soldiers who were poor and did not possess enough property to qualify in the past would serve under Marius, and in return, Marius would lead them to victory, would allow them to plunder the enemy, would allow them to enrich themselves through combat, and if they served honorably, he would use his political capital to be sure that they were compensated further for their service. And so it was left to Marius to build this new way that a commander interacted with his soldiers. The soldiers now were depending on their commander, not only for military success that would lead to plunder, but also for future political protection that would enable the commander to earn for the soldiers gratitude and rewards provided by the Roman state. And they were then invested very strongly in the career of Marius. Now, at this moment, Marius may have understood that what he was doing was building a group of Roman veterans who would be intensely loyal to him. And if asked, potentially would put his political interests and their political interests above those of other Romans with perhaps more compelling cases to make on the basis of the larger good done for the society. But in Africa, when Marius shows up with his new army, the results are dramatic. These soldiers did indeed fight hard. They fought effectively. They served Marius with eagerness. They served Marius with capability. And ultimately, the results were dramatic because Jagertha was captured, his army was defeated, and Marius was triumphant. And just as Marius had done this and stepped down from his command, a new threat emerged to the north of Rome. This is a set of Germanic tribes that had been pushed south and had defeated a set of Roman field armies in what's now southern France. And following a battle, they began to enter northern Italy. Marius was then elected to 5 consecutive consulships spanning the years from 104 to 99 BC so that he could deal with this crisis and its aftermath. And this was unprecedented. No Roman had ever held so many consulships in succession. In fact, it was actually usually frowned upon to hold to hold 2 consulships in succession. So Marius holding 5 was really remarkable. But again, Marius emerged victorious. And this is, in some ways, one of the most interesting coins ever issued by the Roman Republic. This is a coin that, on the surface, doesn't look all that special. This figure of a person in a Roman triumphal chariot with 4 horses, this is a very standard back of a Roman coin. But if you look a little more closely at this, you see a couple of things that are quite interesting. First of all, there are 2 people in that chariot. One of them is an adult wearing a toga. The other is a young person. This is a clear giveaway about what's being shown here, because we're told that in Marius's triumphal procession, he brought his son, and his son was in the chariot while Marius triumphed. This is very clearly a subtle but unmistakable representation of Marius's triumph. The other thing that's interesting about this, if you look at the top of the coin, you see a Q. This means that this is not a regularly issued coin. It's a special issue, issued later in the year by a Roman official called a quaestor. And so a quaestor issue means that this is not part of the annual allocation of silver that's going to be minted into coins. It's part actually of something different. It's a supplemental issue because there's all of a sudden a new expense that the Roman state has to meet. This new expense seems to be the cost of compensating Marius's veterans. And so what you have here is a silver coin that is issued showing Marius in a triumphal procession with his son there. And it is very clear by the Q on top of it that this is a special issue commemorating the victory over Marius, and it is representing an expenditure that is used to reward Marius's soldiers as well. The other reason this is special is prior to the issue of this coin, no Roman coin had ever depicted a living Roman before. And so when Marius appears on this coin and when Marius' son appears on this coin, it is a complete break with tradition. It's subtle, but it's also clear. Now the question becomes, after Marius' triumph, what happens to the veterans of Marius' army? What happens to the men who had served under Marius, who did not meet the property qualification, and were depending on Marius to receive their rewards? Well, basically, this coin shows what happens. They get these rewards, but they get these rewards not out of the gratitude of all the Roman public. They get these rewards because Marius worked with political allies to be sure that they were rewarded. And the landless veterans become intensely loyal to their commander because they know that it's their commander who is going to get them these rewards. And this was the situation that Marius faced. He needed to find politicians who would support laws that gave land to his veterans. But Marius also had a really, really good negotiating tool. He had those veterans that he could mobilize not only on behalf of the proposals to reward those veterans, but also on behalf of whatever else his political allies wanted. And so Marius found a willing ally in a man named Gaius Saturninus, a tribune of the plebs in 103 BC who got rewards for Marius's African veterans. But Saturninus was able to do this only because Marius was able to use the threats of possible violence by Marius's veterans to overcome tribunal vetoes that were threatening to sabotage Saturninus's agenda. Now, Saturninus was elected again in 100 BC after Marius's veterans over the Germans. And as part of his program in 100 BC, he again pushed forward this idea of rewarding Marius's veterans, but he built this together with a larger legislative package that included things like expanding the distribution of subsidized grain, placing in part legislation giving land in what's now southern France to the veterans of Marius's wars, and overall providing a kind of legislative program that joined the concerns of Marius's veterans with populist concerns that had not really been advanced so aggressively since the death of the Gracchi. And what Saturninus was able to do was to use the support of Marius's veterans to get all of these things together. But Saturninus didn't just depend on Marius's veterans. What Saturninus had also realized is if the veterans loyal to Marius are a useful source of political pressure, it would be even better if Saturninus had his own group of political partisans who would do whatever Saturninus asked and actually use violence, not just threats like Marius's veterans, but actually use violence to support the agenda that Saturninus advanced. And so what Saturninus did is he basically created armed bands of his own supporters who would flood the Campus Martius when voting took place. And Saturninus could also then count on reinforcements from Marius if things looked like this was necessary. Now, as the year 99 dawns, Glaucia and Saturninus, Glaucia is an ally of Saturninus, and Saturninus both organize political campaigns to run for election. And Glaucia, Saturninus' ally, is going to run for the consulship. However, when the voting actually took place, it became clear that Glaucia was going to lose the election. Now, it's important perhaps to pause and talk a little bit about how this voting actually takes place. So earlier we have discussed how the election for the Roman consulship is something that takes place in the Comitia Centuriata, the Centuriate Assembly, originally created by Servius Tullius. The voting in the Centuriate Assembly is something that occurs kind of progressively. So each of the centuries votes, and their vote is announced progressively. And because there are two candidates for consul, they vote until one person has a majority, and then once that person has the majority, they then vote again for the second candidate. Now, as this voting takes place, kind of like how the Electoral College vote is announced in the House of Representatives, where they say, Alabama, however many electoral votes goes for whoever, Alaska, however many electoral votes goes for whoever, and this keeps going on until it's clear somebody has won. Then they continue to announce the votes, but it's kind of an academic exercise after somebody has reached the critical margin in the Electoral College. The voting in the Comitia Centuriata for consul proceeds similarly. Every individual votes, and then each of the centuries' votes are announced progressively until it becomes clear that somebody has won. Now, as they are announcing the votes, it can become clear that someone will lose before they have officially lost. And so while the voting is being announced, Glaucia realizes that he is going to lose. And he and the armed supporters of Saturninus flood the Campus Martius, they disrupt the counting of the votes, and they kill one of the people running against Glaucia for the consulship. Then, when they realize that perhaps larger and more powerful forces might get mobilized against them, they flee the Campus Martius, and they cross over and climb the Capitoline Hill. And then they fortify themselves in the Temple of Saturn in a temple atop the Capitoline Hill. What happens at that moment is the Senate calls on Marius, who is consul, serving as consul. The election is for the subsequent year. They call on Marius to respond. And Marius does this by going to the Capitoline, cutting off the water to the temple, forcing then Saturninus and Glaucia to agree to vacate the temple, and then they go to the Senate House in the Roman Forum. And Marius is hoping that they can then be held in the Senate House and they can be put under trial and maybe they can escape conviction. It's not clear what Marius thought would happen, but before they could actually be put on trial, a pro-senatorial mob surrounds the Senate House and burns them alive. So in 99 BC, at the end of Marius's final of those 5 consecutive consulships, Marius's 2 most prominent allies and their most aggressive supporters are burned to death on Marius's watch, and Marius is not able to prevent this. Now, this, of course, has a really clear impact on Marius's political career. Marius goes into a kind of political exile, and from 99 until basically the end of the 90s, Marius is kind of in the wilderness. But not long after the death of Saturninus, Rome is faced with another threat, and this is a threat that arises entirely because of Rome's own problems in understanding how Italian political concerns are being represented in the Republic. This is a revolt of Rome's Italian allies. Now, who are the Italian allies? Well, the Italian allies are these people belonging to city-states in Italy who were not made Roman citizens. They were, in a sense, allowed to continue living under their own independent laws. And generally speaking, these were the cities that had remained loyal to Rome in the war against Hannibal. If they hadn't, Rome would have, of course, defeated them, and they would no longer be Roman allies. They would be absorbed either as subjects or as, forced to take Roman citizenship. But in the period between Hannibal's defeat and 90 BC, a number of significant changes had happened that turned allied status from something that was desirable to something that actually was a kind of second-class status in the Roman Commonwealth that joined Rome with the cities of Italy. Because as Roman economic development occurred in the 2nd century BC, Rome began implementing laws that advantaged Roman citizens in ways that disadvantaged Italian allies. But Italian allies had no direct say in how those laws were put together. The most prominent example of this, of course, was Tiberius Gracchus's Land Commission, which was investigating and taking land rented by Italian allies, taking it out of the cultivation of Italian allies and giving this land to Roman citizens. But there were other examples too. And these long-standing complaints concerned things like Rome would declare war, and Rome would dictate where and when the fighting occurred, and Italian allies would have to go along with it without really having a say in the foreign policy that their arms and their lives were being put on the battlefield to protect. The first real murmurings of discontent came in 125 BC when the city of Fregellae revolted after it had become clear that the Roman political class was only willing to a certain degree to listen to allied concerns. But the first real attempt to address this problem came with Gaius Gracchus, where Gaius Gracchus proposed citizenship for Italian allies as part of the larger reform program in which Gaius Gracchus also proposed a series of reforms to try to increase the material prospects of Roman citizens. What Gaius Gracchus was trying to do there was actually quite sophisticated, and it actually was a generation ahead of where many other Roman politicians would be. Because what Gaius saw is there was a need for Roman policy to provide more of a safety net for regular Romans, but there wasn't a way to provide that safety net without also disadvantaging Rome-Italian allies. And so what Gaius hoped to do was expand the safety net for Roman citizens, but remove the penalties on Italian allies by incorporating them as Roman citizens. But when the expansion of citizenship to Italian allies was voted down, the problem actually just became worse. And other proposals to address this also failed. But the last moment when the problem of Rome's Italian allies' status could have been solved happens in 91 BC. And this involved a man named Livius Drusus, who was a tribune at that time. Now, Livius Drusus is actually a very complicated figure because his actual agenda, even though some of his proposals look populist, his actual agenda is an aristocratic agenda. What Livius Drusus was trying to do was to get a law passed that changed the composition of juries so that aristocrats could again dominate juries that would judge other aristocrats during corruption trials. But Livius Drusus knew that that was kind of a non-starter, that nobody trusted aristocrats to not be corrupt. And so he put this together in a legislative package that also included populist proposals like more subsidized grain for the poor. When it became clear that these proposals would upset Italian allies, he then added in a third component of this. So there's an aristocratic component, there's a populist component, and then to appease Italian allies who were agitating with allies in among other tribunes of the plebs and saying that this was a totally unsupportable thing, Livius Drusus then says, okay, well then we'll extend citizenship to all Italians. Now, is he a firm proponent of establishing citizenship for all Italians? No, it's actually an afterthought. It's a kind of political gambit where he's trying to actually build support for the one aspect of this law he really wants, which is jury reform, by giving everybody else in Roman and Italian society something that they can get behind, so that the entire package has something for everybody. And if there's something for everybody, maybe they will let this jury reform go through. But the problem is, everybody sees through this. Livius Drusus is not a particularly skilled politician. And there's opposition to the measure that's so significant that before the measure comes up for a vote, Livius Drusus is stabbed in his own house. And it's never clear exactly who did it. It's a very good, very well executed political assassination. But the response to this is an eruption. The Roman political class, both populists and non-populists, had been diddling around for too long. And after 35 years of frustration, Italian allies then revolt. The Italians very quickly marshal an army of 100,000 troops and declare a break from Rome. And they begin issuing their own coinage. This is a really spectacular coin because it shows these Italian allies taking an oath to oppose Rome. Even better is this coin, a coin that shows an Italian bull trampling a Roman wolf. And what's interesting about this, even more interesting about this, is on the bottom, the legend is actually, it's not written in Latin, it's written in Oscan. And so what you see here is a genuine movement to react against Roman oppression and second-class status that Italian allies were holding in the Roman Commonwealth. The other thing that's important about this is these Italian allies are the same people who serve alongside Rome. They have the same equipment, they have the same training, they have the same experience. They are really good fighters. And so Rome initially falls into arguments about, well, whose fault is it and who's on the side of Livius Drusus, and it doesn't take seriously the threat that the Italians are mounting until it becomes very clear in 91. This is a really serious problem. These people can fight. And these people are hardcore when it comes to fighting. And people like the Oscans are really, really difficult to defeat. And so it very quickly becomes something where Rome wakes up to the situation. Rome begins trotting out a kind of all-star team of former commanders, including Marius. Marius is brought out of retirement, and he's actually sent to and take control of Roman forces campaigning in Umbria and in Tuscany and in the north. Because this is a region that Rome was particularly concerned about. The south had already exploded. Rome was concerned with keeping the north under control, and Marius does a reasonably good job. But the solution to this, Romans quickly realize, is not military. They are not going to be able to defeat these troops in battle. Instead, what they need to do is co-opt them. And so a series of laws are passed extending citizenship in ever larger chunks to these Italian allies. So in 90 BC, a law called the Lex Julia, sponsored by a relative of Julius Caesar, extends citizenship to all of the Roman allies who did not revolt or who had revolted but decided to lay down their arms. And so a significant component of Italy immediately becomes Roman citizens. Then in 89 BC, the Lex Claudia Papiria is a law that offers citizenship to any person resident in an allied city who registers before a Roman praetor, a Roman government official. And so what the initial law, the Lex Julia, says is any community that didn't revolt, everybody in that community now has Roman citizenship. And this takes a lot of the fuel out of the Italian fire. The Lex Claudia Papiria says, okay, even if you live in a community that did revolt, and that community is still revolting, if you are not in favor of the revolt and you want to stop the fighting, just come before a Roman praetor, declare that you want to be a Roman citizen, and congratulations, we'll do this to you. Then in 88 BC, the Lex Pompeia is a law that is issued that extends citizenship to everyone south of the Po River in the Italian peninsula, whether they want it or not. And there are people who still don't really want it. But this is the solution to the social war. There's a lot of fighting, but ultimately the solution is a totally transparent one and a very easy one to arrive at. The solution was the same solution that Tiberius Gracchus, or that Gaius Gracchus was pushing 35 years before. The solution was simply make Italians full citizens in the Roman state. Make the Roman Commonwealth an Italian/Roman nation, where everyone in Italy maintains their language, maintains their culture, maintains their civic associations, but is now part of this Roman polity in a full way, so that all political decisions made in Rome have the full input of everyone in Italy who's going to bear the implications of it. It's an easy solution, but it wasn't a solution Romans were willing to embrace simply because the political dynamics in Rome made them unwilling to share the rewards of Roman citizenship with allies who at this point really richly deserved it. But while Rome is dealing with the social war, Roman foreign policy is dramatically upset by people who are trying to take advantage of the problems Rome has domestically. And the biggest leader of this is a man named Mithridates of Pontus. Pontus is a region along the Black Sea coast in what's now Turkey. But Mithridates of Pontus basically senses that Roman weakness will allow him to expand his power in a dramatic way. And so he invades the Roman provinces of Asia, the Roman province of Asia that is basically what's now Western Turkey. He not only takes over much of this territory, but he massacres a large number of Roman citizens there. And we talked previously about what this massacre does to the Roman financial system, but it's also a really significant threat to Roman ability to project power around the Mediterranean. And this leads us to the second great figure who pioneers ways of using political violence in Rome, a man named Sulla. Now, Sulla is a Roman commander who plays an important role in kind of all of the things we've talked about so far in this discussion. Sulla was, for a long time, one of Marius's most trusted deputies. So when Jagertha of Numidia surrendered to Marius, or to Marius's army, it was actually Sulla who accepted this surrender of Marius, not Marius himself. Sulla served alongside Marius until basically the middle of the campaign against the Germans, and then Sulla had a break with Marius and started pursuing his own agenda. It's in the social war that Sulla really rises to the top level of Roman commanders, because Sulla is able to take control of the Roman campaign in southern Italy in a way that brings him to such prominence that Sulla ultimately wins the consulship in 88 BC. And part of the command that the consuls of Sulla's year were supposed to take over was the command against Mithridates. And so Sulla is initially allotted the command against Mithridates. And this is something that is very, very exciting for Sulla, but it's even more exciting for Sulla's soldiers. After Marius had kind of broken the mold and started recruiting landless soldiers into his armies, many other Roman commanders followed suit. And Sulla was, in a sense, the next wave of this kind of commander. Because Sulla understood that when you have an army like that is willing to and capable of understanding their future prosperity depends on the success of their commanders, there is a way to build that bond and make that bond even stronger. And what Sulla was able to do was work with his army to build a really tremendous amount of trust and a genuine affection that the soldiers felt for Sulla as a commander. And when Sulla gets the command against Mithridates, Sulla and his soldiers are thinking that this is a really wonderful opportunity for all of them. Because Mithridates is the biggest public enemy in Rome after he overruns Asia and kills 100,000 or so Roman soldiers. There's Mithridates. 100,000 or so Roman citizens. And induces a financial panic in Rome. Romans hate Mithridates, and Romans will love the people who defeat Mithridates and actually kind of punch back in a way that shows Rome again emphasizing and demonstrating its greatness. And a campaign in Asia also promised not just glory, but a lot of money, because some of the richest cities in the entire world were the cities in Western Asia Minor that Mithridates had overrun. And so if Sulla's armies can get in there and his soldiers can serve against Mithridates, there is ample opportunity for them to become very, very wealthy. And so the soldiers are excited. Sulla is excited. This is probably the most desirable command for a Roman in maybe the last half century. But it's so desirable a command that other Romans want it as well. And one of the people who wants it is Marius. And so Marius begins plotting to have the command stripped from Sulla so that he might take it himself. And Marius found an ally in a man named Publius Sulpicius Rufus. Now, Sulpicius is a very intriguing figure because Sulpicius had learned from what Saturninus and Glaucia had done. Sulpicius had built a personal army of 3,000 partisans, but in this he'd actually created a kind of elite corps of 600 that he called his anti-Senate. There's 600 aristocrats in the Senate. There's 600 rabble-rousers that are armed and trained by Sulpicius who are the anti-Senate. And using the anti-Senate to intimidate voters, Sulpicius proposed a law that replaced Sulla with Marius for the command against Mithridates. Now, Sulla and his co-consul held a meeting at which they argued that this was an illegal thing to do, and they tried to prevent a vote on this law from happening. When Sulla and his co-consul did this, Sulpicius set his anti-Senate loose on the assembly. They killed the son of Sulla's co-consul. The co-consul had to run away, and Sulla actually fled the scene and, of all ironies, took refuge in the house of Marius. But the fighting by the anti-Senate killed a number of prominent Sullan supporters. And then when everybody was terrified, Sulpicius then had a vote on his law, and the law replacing Sulla was approved under this terrible cloud of violence. Now, it seems that what Marius expected and what Sulpicius expected was that Sulla would be intimidated and he would go into exile somewhere, and Marius would then lead the campaign against Mithridates, and this would be another kind of disreputable chapter in the use of political violence within Rome, but you would still have a republican system in which the basic veneer of representative democracy existed, and violence was something that was introduced occasionally when people felt it was useful to do so. It's not a great situation, but what follows is much worse. Because instead of going into exile, Sulla went to his army. And he went to his army that was still engaged in mop-up operations against some of the last holdouts in the social war. Sulla went before his army and he explained the situation to them, and he told them that he needed them to protect his interests and asked them would they do what's required of them. An interesting situation then unfolds. All but one of Sulla's officers are appalled at what Sulla is asking, because what Sulla is doing is he's hinting at turning his army against the city of Rome, marching a Roman army against the capital, and capitalizing upon the loyalty that this army felt for their commander over the loyalty that they felt for the Republic. All but one of Sulla's officers are horrified by this, and they leave. They refuse to endorse this. But Sulla's men, those landless soldiers, they are very enthusiastic about this. They are much more enthusiastic about their commander and the prospects of rewards that he promises than they are about the abstract principles of the Republic. And so Sulla's army marches on Rome. It breaches the city walls. When it breaches the city walls, Roman residents start throwing broken roof tiles as kind of missiles at the soldiers. Sulla orders his soldiers to shoot fire arrows onto Roman houses. Roman civilians are killed by Sulla's army as Sulla takes the capital. And then Sulla has a law passed that orders the execution of Marius, Sulpicius, and 10 others. Sulpicius is actually executed. Marius flees. Then Sulla supervises the election of the consuls for the next year and leaves for Asia to go fight Mithridates. Marius briefly returns to Rome, joins up with an ally who has put together an army of Etruscans, who are upset at what Sulla has done. They take Rome back from people loyal to Sulla, and they bring about a reign of terror against supporters of Sulla, in which a lot of them are killed. Now, Marius arranges for himself to be elected consul for the year 86, his 6th consulship, but then he dies very quickly after being sworn into office. And by 83, Sulla has returned to Italy. When he returns to Italy, he routs the forces loyal to the popular politicians in line with the successors of Marius, and he has himself appointed dictator for the reconstitution of the state. It's at this moment that Sulla shows us where a culture of political violence ultimately leads. The logical end of this is if political violence is allowed, citizen rights are suspended. What we saw with the murder of Tiberius Gracchus and his followers is a few hundred people have their citizen rights suspended and their lives taken through political violence. With Gaius Gracchus, it's a few thousand. By the time of Sulla, it's tens of thousands, maybe 100,000. Because the process of taking vengeance and using violence doesn't easily stop once it's started. If citizen rights don't matter, if the basic protection a republic provides to its citizens no longer exists, there is nothing to stop the slaughter except someone like Sulla saying that they are tired of killing others. So when Plutarch talks about what happens when Sulla gets into the city, when he takes the city from the forces loyal to Marius's successors and allies, Plutarch says, Sulla now busied himself with slaughter, so that murders without numbers or limits filled the city. Sulla first, when he comes into Rome, publishes a list of 40 senators and 1,600 Roman knights who were supposed to be executed and whose property was to be confiscated. Now, at a later point, when Julius Caesar is arguing against the murder of Roman citizens without trial, the execution of Roman citizens without trial, Caesar says that everybody applauded this initial step of using murder and using vengeance and using violence against the people who were most responsible for using murder and violence and taking vengeance on Sulla's supporters when Marius took the city. But this first list of 40 senators whose execution was ordered and his property was confiscated, this is just the beginning. Sulla then offers rewards to the people who find these senators, rewards to their assassins, rewards to any informer who can help those assassins track these people down. More people across Italy are soon added to this list. And as the list grows, people on it are included not because they did anything wrong, but just simply because they were suspected of being kind to people who are already on the list of proscribed people. And in some cases, we're told that Sulla added them simply because some of Sulla's supporters wanted their house or wanted their farm. And so the supporters asked Sulla to execute this guy. Sulla had nothing against this person, but he added him to the list anyway, simply because someone had asked him to do this. But Sulla saved the worst violence for the Senate meeting when he announced what form the Roman state would take after he had defeated Marius. Now that he had defeated Marius, what is Rome like? What is the future going to be like now that the civil war is over and Sulla has won? Sulla initially said to the Senate that he would be there soon to take care of the guilty, but he assured the Senate that the citizens, both the old citizens and the new citizens, so the old citizens are people who were citizens before the social war, and the new citizens are people who got citizenship in the course of the social war, that none of these would have any reason to make a complaint against them. But once Sulla came into the city of Rome, he called a Senate meeting, and he called it at a very interesting place. He called it for the Temple of Bologna. This is what remains of the Temple of Bologna. If you go now to the area of the Forum Boarium, you walk around there, you can find this kind of area. The Temple of Bologna is not a special thing right now. But in 83 BC, the Temple of Bologna sat above a circus, a race course that was made by Flaminius. We remember Flaminius from back in the discussion of the campaign against Hannibal. Flaminius had built a race course, and the Temple of Bologna sat above it. Now, the Roman Senate met in different places at different times, but Sulla summoned the Senate to come together at the Temple of Bologna. Now, there are a couple of symbolic things about this. The first one is the Temple of Bologna is a space dedicated to a goddess known for bloodthirsty madness in battle. And so this is a very strange place for you to schedule your oration outlining what the new structure of the Roman Republic will be like now that you have won a civil war. Why wouldn't you choose, say, a temple devoted to Concord? There's a Temple of Concord in the Roman Forum, right near where the Senate House now stands. Why not use that? Or why not use something ambiguous? Why would you pick a temple devoted to the goddess of madness in battle? Well, the answer is that this is just above the circus. And at the same moment that Sulla began to speak in the Senate about what his new republic is going to look like, those assigned to the task began to cut to pieces 6,000 prisoners of war in the circus below. The cries of the crowd being massacred filled the air and terrified the senators. But Sulla ordered the senators to listen to his words and not concern themselves with what was going on outside. The tortures and executions of 6,000 people who were Roman citizens, whose Roman citizenship had been stripped by Sulla, and whose protections, legal protections that citizenship should guarantee, were being ignored by Sulla. Their lives were extinguished while Sulla was pronouncing the birth or the rebirth of Rome's representative democracy. And no one could ignore the contradiction at the core of this, because these tortures and executions, at the moment that Rome's republic is supposed to be restored, undermines the very basic premise at the core of Rome's republic. So again, we'll go back to this quote of Cicero. Cicero says, "A republic is the property of the people, and the people is not a collection of humans assembled in any old way, but a collection of a multitude joined to one another by consensus about law and the common good. All Roman citizens, and after the social war, all Italians are stakeholders in this Roman republic. And when Rome extended citizenship to new communities or people, those new communities and people became stakeholders in its republic. This meant that their voices mattered in any conversation about law and the common good. And this was a principle that Rome had upheld until Sulla. But the voices of the people that Sulla massacred in the circus below were the voices of Roman citizens whose lives and legal statuses and protections as citizens of the Roman Republic were taken away. This is true, too, of the thousands of other Romans whose lives and property he took, sometimes because they opposed him politically, sometimes because they helped his political opponents, sometimes simply because somebody who was loyal to Sulla wanted their house. All of those people were Romans whose citizenship status was ignored. How then do we have a republic when this basic principle of a republic is not being observed? Well, part of the problem of understanding Sulla's reaction, which is a very fundamentally destructive thing to a republic, is understanding why Sulla felt this was necessary. And to do this, we should turn back to the idea of why Sulla marched on Rome. The historian Appian says why he thinks this happened. Sulla felt that the march on Rome was justified because after what Sulpicius and Marius had done, Sulla believed that the Republic no longer had the capacity to provide perpetual security to himself and those exiles who had fled to him. Let's think about that for a second. Sulla is a citizen of Rome. Sulla believes that the Republic should protect his interests. It should protect his life. It should protect his property. It should protect his freedoms. And when Marius and Sulpicius orchestrated the violence that led to Sulla being replaced as the commander against Mithridates, Sulla as an individual felt that the Republic did not any longer have the capacity to protect him, to protect his rights, to protect his life. And Sulla as an individual is victimized by that same Republican failure that will take the lives, when Sulla is in charge, of those 6,000 people in the circus, of those tens of thousands of Romans who fight in the civil war, and of those many thousands of Romans who lose their property and lives in Sulla's prescriptions. With this single sentence of saying that the Republic no longer provides security to him and his exiles, Sulla made clear that he was contemplating seizing power, but Sulla also, Appian suggests, made clear that this was necessary because the Republic had already failed. And if it had failed him, he needed to be sure that he did what was necessary to protect himself. Ultimately, once Sulla took power, and once Sulla made this announcement to the Senate, what Sulla described in that announcement was a plan to restore the Republic so it could again, in Sulla's view, provide the security to himself and the Roman citizens who all now felt that the Republic had failed them. To do this, Sulla arranged for the Senate to give him a full amnesty for his actions during the war. And this was granted, again, in this larger context of the Republic failing to provide the protection it guaranteed. Sulla was then granted power of life and death, power of confiscation, power of colonization, power of founding or demolishing cities, and the power of taking away or bestowing kingdoms at his pleasure. And for the better part of almost 3 years, Sulla used this power to rebuild the Republic in the way that he thought it ought to work. There was a lot that Sulla tried to do to try to restore protections and processes that looked like the Republic that Sulla remembered. But what Sulla didn't understand is the culture of violence and the Republic of violence that had grown up so dramatically in the 50 years between the death of Tiberius Gracchus and Sulla's march on Rome wasn't something that could be put away again. There was no going back to the old ways of the peaceful republic before violence dominated political life. Romans wanted desperately to believe that this was the case, but Romans were mistaken. And what we would see subsequently is that Sulla was unable to create a structure that would work in the future.